She was from Norwich, Connecticut, a mother, and by all accounts, somebody who loved to talk with people, wanted everybody to like her, and was a hustler. She had worked as a card dealer. She was a telemarketer. She worked as a cashier, trying to piece it all together, but it just wasn't enough to provide for her family. And that's when she turned to sex work. Maureen would put herself out on Craigslist. She would just put out an ad, put out her number, and if somebody was interested, they would call her or message her, and she would just start the transaction there.
Sex work changed dramatically in the 1990s because of the advent of the internet. It was free and easily available. Before that, women had to literally work the stroll, meaning they had to work the streets and pick up Johns who would pull up in their cars. They would get into the car. It was highly, highly dangerous work. But by advertising on Craigslist or Backpages, you get to pick and choose who you decide to meet with. There's a little bit more control for the woman who's engaging in sex work. But that sense of control is really a mirage. Once they are in that car or in that house, he still has all the control.
Maureen would often go down to Manhattan from Connecticut because she could make more money there and she could make it faster. July 6, 2007, Maureen's cell phone is contacted by a burner cell phone. And over the next few days, there are 16 interactions between these two phones. Maureen was working out of a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She called a friend to let them know that she was going on an out call to meet a client. She was never seen again. Maureen's family and friends are gripped with fear. They have no idea what happened to her. Then, Maureen's friend got a call from an unfamiliar number. On the other end of the line, a man tells her friend that he has seen Maureen and that he saw her at a whorehouse in Queens. At first, she's excited. Oh, you've seen my friend. Where's this address? We've been looking for her. I want to go find her. And he says, well, I'll call you back and I'll give you the address. She waits, and he never calls back. What becomes a pattern is that one of these victims leaves, they walk out the door, they're never seen again, but their cell phone records and data tell us something different. Two years later, it's the week after the 4th of July, and another woman is about to go missing. Melissa Barthelemy was from Buffalo, New York, and she had dreams of becoming a hairdresser in New York City. It was something she really wanted to do. Her friend said it was her passion. But when she went to Manhattan, she fell into sex work. When she first started out, she would do what was called the stroll in Times Square, going up and down the street, outside of strip clubs. But she always had the watchful eye of a man who she worked with, who would be across the street, who would look out for her and kind of had her back. Then there's this trade-off that happens. She says, I want to do this on my own, and I'm going to put ads on Craigslist. So she could make the deal, do everything herself, keep the money. However, she's giving up the protection of the guy that was watching her back. On July 3rd, 2009, Melissa was contacted by somebody with a burner phone. The person wants to pay her $1,000. That's a lot of money. And after that, Melissa disappeared. A week after Melissa vanishes, a man started using her phone to call her little sister, Amanda, and made some really disturbing comments.
He went into great detail about all of the horrible things he allegedly did to her.
Your sister is missing, your phone rings, and her caller ID comes up, and you're hoping that maybe it's her. And instead, on the other end of the line is a man saying that not only has he sexually assaulted your sister, he also reveals that he killed her too. And the man called Melissa's sister over and over again. The NYPD was able to trace those calls through a cell tower to Midtown Manhattan. But the calls never lasted long enough to pinpoint an exact location. And then after that, the phone calls completely stopped.
This is somebody who really does have a sadistic quality. He likes the idea, not only of reliving it by talking to family members who are going to be the most devastated, but tormenting, taunting them about that. Domination and control is really the motive. It's the payoff. When you're looking at somebody who is a sadistic sexual serial killer, sadly, they view their victims where it's like, this person, they aren't on the same level as the people that I care about. They're different. Whatever the rationalization is, this person isn't worth quite as much. But we know that there are always family members who care about these victims. There are always family members looking for their loved one.
Greg Waterman, Megan Waterman's older brother. Growing up, she was a big pain in my ass, but all we had was each other. We walked to school together, we walked home together, go roller skating every Saturday afternoon. At the end of the day, when she needed me or I needed her, like, we were there.
Megan Waterman had a pretty difficult childhood and became a mom herself at the age of 18. She wasn't prepared for this, and in order to provide for her child and provide maybe a better life, that's when she turned to sex work and trying to make ends meet.
She used to call herself a call girl, which I used to call her an idiot. But she did it for her daughter, and when I think about it nowadays, I understand it, I get it. My sister said, when I have a child, I'm gonna give that child everything I couldn't have, no matter what I had to do to get it. She cared too much, you know what I mean? Like, she's got a good soul. She was living in Maine, but she'd go down to New York a couple weekends a month. She was only down there from like probably Thursday to Monday. Gonna drive up and be back home for like a week and a half, then she'd go down the next weekend.
In early June of 2010, Megan Waterman gets on a bus and heads down to New York City. And then she relocates to a hotel in Hauppauge on Long Island. It's about 50 miles east of New York City. On June 5th, 2010, Megan Waterman's cell phone is contacted by a burner cell phone that had been activated just that day. And that communication is right around the same time that we see her leaving on surveillance video from that hotel in Hauppauge. After she left the hotel, she was never seen again.
I'd always like call and check in. When she didn't answer, I had a very, very bad gut feeling that something was wrong. It was multiple days of no contact. She never went a day without talking to her daughter many, many times. I went down in New York, went to the hotel in Hauppauge that she was at, passed out like 4,000 flyers, put them everywhere. I didn't know what happened to Megan, but I knew something went right. New York wouldn't tell us nothing. I've never seen like any law enforcement or anything that's just so disrespectful over someone that's missing. Because of what she did, she got put to the bottom. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's granddaughter, somebody's niece, somebody's aunt, somebody's cousin, somebody's, friend, best friend, doesn't matter. Like, she was a human being.
Back then, there was a sense that these women were isolated victims. No one had any idea that there was a serial killer at work. And it would only be a matter of months before he struck again.
The downfall of every power control killer. It's their ego. Their ego gets too big. They think that they are smarter than everybody else. And that makes them careless. They think they've gotten away with it, and that's when they slip up.
And that's exactly what happened when Amber Costello disappeared.
She was a loving, sweet, beautiful girl, the biggest heart. I think about her all the time. I mean, she's just a loving human being, and I miss her terribly.
Amber was originally from North Carolina and had a very difficult childhood. She struggled with addiction on and off throughout most of her life and fell into sex work when she was very young.
Amber Costello was known for sort of pulling this ruse with a friend of hers where the friend would pretend to be her significant other and sort of barge in on her while she was with a John so that, you know, she could keep the money and not have to perform the services.
September 1st, 2010, Amberlynn Costello is contacted by somebody using a burner phone. And it was that very night that a client came to her home in West Babylon.
This client was described as being very, very big. One other thing that the roommate remembered, the man was driving a dark green vehicle that was a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, a very unique kind of vehicle. It's sort of a cross between a pickup and a car. He had given the money to Amber Costello for sexual services. When the client got there, this roommate pretended to be an outraged boyfriend, and then the client sheepishly ran out of the house.
So the next day, September 2nd, this client contacts Amber and says, I want to see you again, but I don't want to do it at the house because of the boyfriend. On the night of September 2nd, a witness sees Amber Costello leaving her home, going out to the street to meet someone, and then sees a dark-colored truck go by, coming from the direction that Amber had just gone to. And she was never seen or heard from again. 4 women just vanished, basically under the radar. And we probably wouldn't have found out what happened to them had it not been for a 24-year-old woman named Shannan Gilbert.
Oak Beach is a small little private hamlet on the southern part of Long Island. It's a closed-end community, and it's right on the water. Unless you've been down there to the ocean going swimming or surfing, or you were a fisherman, you really didn't know this place existed. The Shannan Gilbert case is interesting. I believe she's the only working girl that came with her own security.
May 1st, 2010, Shannan Gilbert has a driver. And he takes her out to Oak Beach to this client's house.
And then something goes terribly wrong at the John's house.
Shannan Gilbert makes a 911 call.
Hello, you dialed into the 911 system. How can I assist you? There's somebody after me. Where are you? There's somebody after me. Where are you, ma'am? I don't know. Can you check where I am? No, I can't. What's your name? Gilbert.
She then says to the 911 operator,
These people are trying to kill me.
and she makes the rational choice, which is to run. When she does, you hear these blood-curdling screams.
Her driver did not stay around after Shannan Gilbert ran off. Perhaps he thought that she went to a house. Perhaps he thought she made her way to Ocean Parkway, but he left.
We know that she flees the house, but by the time the police finally do arrive, Shannan's nowhere to be found.
At some point, the police got involved, but it didn't seem like there was a great will initially to find her.
Her mother, Mary Gilbert, and Shannan's boyfriend went to the Suffolk County Police to file a missing persons for Shannan. And the police officers there brushed them off. Oh, she's a hooker. She's a prostitute. She'll turn up.
Shannan Gilbert's mother, Mary, was not letting the police forget her daughter. She wanted to make sure there was some kind of search going on. She got out there with other members of the family in front of the media.
Gilbert's mother says police never took her daughter's disappearance seriously.
If we weren't always on the phone, they may not have ever searched at all.
Many people believe that you are a victim because it's something you did, right? Victim blaming. And if you're in sex work, you know, it's kind of like, well, what'd you expect kind of thing. And unfortunately, that was pretty pervasive.
Eventually, law enforcement did canine searches for Shannan Gilbert in the Oak Beach area. Turned up nothing. 7 months later, there's finally a development. In December 2010, I was mostly working day shifts at Pix 11 News. So I would watch the 10 o'clock news at night before I'd go to bed. And this one night, December 11th of 2010, I noticed that there was a really big story leading the newscast. And it was out in Gilgo Beach, which is very close to Oak Beach on the south shore of Long Island. Gilgo Beach is a barrier beach. One side faces the Atlantic Ocean, the other side, the Great South Bay. And Ocean Parkway cuts right through. It's a state park that a lot of people don't know about except the locals.
Gilgo Beach just had this reputation of being the loveliest beach on Long Island. Now, when I hear Gilgo Beach, I think murder.
In December 2010, a canine officer from the Suffolk County Police Department was with his dog on Ocean Parkway, and the dog reacted to something in the brush.
At some point, the dog gave me an indication. His tail started waving. He started sampling the air, indicating to a spot off the shoulder of the parkway.
The dog alerts, and he goes into a very thick, wooded area. Very determined to dig for what it has discovered. The police officer sees that it is a body wrapped in burlap.
In December of 2010, while looking for a missing woman named Shannan Gilbert, a canine officer found remains along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach.
They found skeletal remains of a very petite young woman. The immediate assumption was this must be Shannan Gilbert, but there's nothing to identify this woman.
No clothing, no purse, no wallet, no identifying jewelry.
But it was just the beginning. Police decide they're going to keep searching. Then lo and behold, on December 13th, they find 3 more bodies.
All 4 victims were bound, 3 of them with tape and camouflage burlap, and the 4th was bound by 3 belts. All likely died of homicidal strangulation.
All 4 of these bodies belong to young women, and their bodies are largely intact. There's skeletal remains, but they're mostly mummified.
4 bodies, 3 days, and countless questions.
When these 4 women were found in 2010, Richard Dormer was the police commissioner in Suffolk County, and he was about to retire. And now he's got this huge case on his hands.
Monday morning, homicide responded back to the location where the body was found and located 3 more bodies. They weren't all clustered, but they were within a quarter of a mile of each other, which would indicate that they were dumped there by the same person or persons.
Many people believed that the killer was somebody who knew this area well. There's not going to be a lot of people going into these areas looking for anything. It's thick and it's thorny. You wouldn't even consider walking in there as a layperson. But if you live and know this area well, you would know that this is a perfect hiding spot.
The New York City Medical Examiner is helping local authorities identify the remains through DNA and dental records.
So they go into this database for missing persons, and it turns out they find dozens of potential matches.
Was missing Megan Waterman the victim of a serial killer on Long Island? The vanished woman from Maine is reported to have traveled to Long Island in response to an ad on Craigslist and might be among the bodies found on Gilgo Beach.
First week of December, they come up, swab me, my mom, and Liliana. They said that they found skeletal remains down in Long Island. They just wanted to get a DNA to match up to this.
Today, police confirmed through DNA that one of the bodies is that of Megan Waterman.
I don't think anybody could really feel the way I felt about it because, like, I lost a big part of me. Like, the only thing I have for 22 years that I could depend on or speak to, so.
Megan Waterman was the first victim to be identified in January of 2011. And then a couple of days later, the police released the identities of the other 3 women.
We are here today to announce that all 4 women whose remains were discovered in Gilgo Beach last month have been positively identified. Maureen Brainard Barnes of Norwich, Connecticut. Melissa Barthelemy of the Bronx. Amber Lynn Costello of North Babylon, New York. And previously announced Megan Waterman of Scarborough, Maine.
We believe that each of the 4 victims met their prearranged client shortly before their deaths.
Once the identities of the Gilgo 4 came out, the victims' families gave interviews.
You'll have so many questions. Why? How? You know, did my sister cry? Did she beg? You know, did she say, please, please, like, I have kids? She was just very kind-hearted, you know? She made mistakes, who doesn't? She didn't deserve this. Nobody deserves this.
I just like to just set the record straight that she wasn't a mean person, and she wasn't a bad person.
It's sad, and I just wanted to get a chance to see where my sister was.
The 4 victims that were found initially during the search for Shannan Gilbert became known as the Gilgo 4.
All 4 of these women who had disappeared over the last several years were advertising on Craigslist. They were sex workers.
As a cold case investigator, if I was looking at this case, I would say that these 4 were all killed by the same person. And why? Left in the same condition, same general area within 500 feet of each other. You would say this was their garden of trophies that they put in there, so to speak.
After the bodies were found, they were all sent to a forensic laboratory. You have to remember that they had been out in the elements, so there wasn't a lot of evidence that could be obtained. But there was a male hair that was found in the burlap that was wrapped around Megan Waterman. The DNA didn't match with any known database, so there wasn't anything that could be done at that time.
Then in early April of 2011, there's something of a surprise find. Very close to the Gilgo 4, police discover remains of an Asian male. And he was wearing women's clothing. So he was perhaps transgender.
The assumption is that this was also a sex worker.
The Asian male found in women's clothing adds a whole other layer to this stuff.
His skull had been crushed, blunt force trauma. So now you have 5 adult bodies, the Gilgo 4 and the Asian male.
But this is not the last body they find.
The police decide to keep searching. They find even more victims, but there's something different this time.
These are not intact bodies, but body parts in the thicket just east of Gilgo.
What they find first is a skull, forearms, and hands. And a skull, hands, and foot. About a week later, police find arms and legs in a plastic bag on Jones Beach. And then they also discover a skull in nearby Tobay Beach.
These are bodies that have been dismembered in the same way, and they're all young women.
Something really disturbing is going on here. All these victims are being dumped on a stretch of Ocean Parkway in this very remote area of southern Long Island. 5 of the victims are intact, but then some of the victims were dismembered. And we're trying to find out, is this one killer? Are there 2 killers? If there are 2 killers, are they using the same dumping ground? What is going on here?
All these partial remains are a huge discovery because it looks like they've been there longer, maybe a lot longer. It makes you wonder, how long has this been going on? In 1997, 13 years before any of the remains turned up on Ocean Parkway, a victim was found on another part of Long Island.
Hempstead Lake State Park is a real family-oriented area. People go there for barbecues, for picnics, for hiking, for biking. So it's not the kind of place where you would expect to find a dead body. A man and his daughter are walking by a pond, and they see a green Rubbermaid container. And they see that there's a body inside.
I am Detective Bill Brosnan. I worked for the Nassau County Police Department Homicide Squad for a little over 21 years. When we first pulled up, my partner and I, we could see the container. We walked down right to it. The body was wrapped in plastic. Somebody just dumped it there thinking that no one will ever find it in this grass-covered area. When we got to the morgue, they took that package apart. There was a flowered print pillowcase. There was a maroon towel. We took the body out of the container, and we realized that it was just a torso.
In 1997, 13 years before any remains were found along Ocean Parkway, a human torso was found at Hempstead Lake State Park. It would end up being tied to the victims of Gilgo Beach in the most tragic way possible.
The medical examiner determined that she was a female African-American between the ages of 18 and 30 years old.
You have a victim where you can't fingerprint them, you can't do a identification based on the face. So we had somebody that was trying to hide the identity.
But whoever did this made a mistake.
The victim had a heart-shaped peaches tattoo above her left breast.
This tattoo was really unique, and it gave detectives a real shot at finding out who this person was.
The tattoo in this case was the whole thing. The Daily News is a big New York City newspaper. I reached out to them and asked them would they throw the picture in their paper. Newsday, they also did an article on it. I actually went to the morgues in the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Manhattan, just to see if they had unclaimed body parts. We did the same thing with Suffolk County. They had nothing. I gave her a name. It's Peaches. I never liked Jane Doe or John Doe. That's not a name. She has a name, and she should have a family. Over the years, this case was always with me. I found out that Peaches had a child within the last year or two because she had a C-section. There was a child missing her mom. All those years, that child must have grown up and said, "Where's mom? Whose mom?"
After the bodies are found along Ocean Parkway, all of them are sent to a forensic laboratory to be tested for DNA. Investigators find out that the legs found on Jones Beach are Peach's legs. In 2011, while investigators were sweeping essentially Ocean Parkway looking for more victims, that is when they found the unimaginable. The remains of a toddler.
The toddler was a female, anywhere from 18 to 24 months or so, wrapped in a blanket with jewelry on her.
I was notified by New York State Police that the child was Peaches' baby.
Who would do something as terrible as this, to leave an infant out in the middle of nowhere just to die?
It's strange that Peaches' body parts were found in Jones Beach and that they were associated with the Gilgo case, and that baby was in Gilgo and found next to another victim. Do I believe that there's more than one killer there? Do serial killers get together and say, hey, here's a good place to dump somebody? I don't think that happened. My opinion is that they could be all related.
Could this really be the work of the same person? The answer is yes. Serial killers learn from their mistakes and evolve over time. We see this all the time.
So now there's this unbelievably disturbing timeline that's being revealed. One killer who's possibly been murdering even the most innocent of victims, and he's perhaps been doing it for decades.
The investigation began as a search for a missing New Jersey prostitute. Shannon Gilbert was last seen a year ago after meeting up with a client that she had met on Craigslist. So far, no trace of Gilbert has been found.
When the Gilgo 4 were found in December 2010, the automatic assumption was one of those women will be Shannon Gilbert. And it was never Shannon Gilbert. The families knew the media can be a partner to them because the media can get the word out there, can spread the information far and wide, especially with the advent of the internet.
I promise that I will continue to fight nonstop until I bring my girl home where she belongs.
I'm here because I really want to support this family, because a lot of people don't care about escorts. They don't care. They're just like, they just don't care.
There were statements made that most of the victims being targeted were sex workers, and the families rightly said, why should that make a difference? They have a right for justice.
After Shannon goes missing, and the first 4 victims that we know now is the Gilgo 4, when their bodies were discovered and their family members were notified, social media became a way for them to become connected. So Facebook became a spot where you had people who were actually organizing searches themselves, trying to spread more information and set up vigils and things like that.
Right now, people out there who are watching, who are listening, who knows about Shannon, I just want to ask you, what if? What if it was someone that you loved? What if it was someone that you cared about?
There was so much media attention because the family did a lot of the legwork with social media. That was something that never really happened in a case before this.
A year and a half after Shannon Gilbert goes missing, there's finally a development.
After an exhaustive, methodical, massive search, we have this day at approximately 9:14 a.m. located a set of skeletal remains
deep into the marsh of Oak Beach. The remains of Shannon Gilbert are finally found. We don't quite know what happened. How did she get into that marsh? But the police were saying it was a tragic accident, that she had drowned. It sort of felt like it was the end of just one facet of the investigation, but really, a lot of us in the media felt like we were no closer to finding out who the killer was.
You have all these remains that are found along Ocean Parkway, and there were no answers.
This is obviously a major investigation. There are no suspects at this time.
But could you speak to leads? Do you have leads and how strong they are?
No, I'd rather not get into that right now.
There was a lot of fear among residents, people just wondering what was going on in Long Island. But we didn't really have any insight on what was going on in the investigation.
So,
We're not getting...
no, well, sometimes we don't have all the information, and that's why we can't give it to you.
You just got the feeling the authorities had no idea what they were doing and were making very little progress.
But what's really remarkable about this case is early on, Suffolk County Police had information and evidence that could have solved this case.
In 2010, shortly after the disappearance of Amber Costello, police had interviewed witnesses, and the witnesses described the John that night leaving a car that they described as a first-generation dark-colored Chevy Avalanche. There was also witness descriptions of the man, describing him as an ogre-like tall figure with bushy hair and glasses. So the police, from what I could gather, as early as 2010, had a description of the serial killer suspect and his vehicle.
And what's also interesting is that investigators, when they started looking at the cell phone records of the Gilgo 4 victims, they realized that there was a pattern here. These victims were contacted by different burner phones for each victim.
In 2011, an FBI analyst was given access to that cell phone data. The analyst was able to sort of produce a report using data from cell towers.
Megan Waterman was last seen leaving the Holiday Inn Express in Hauppauge, Long Island at about 1:30 in the morning.
Pings of these cell phone towers show that Megan Waterman's phone traveled from Hauppauge to Massapequa Park. Massapequa Park is a bedroom community on the southern shore of Long Island, not far from Ocean Parkway, where all the remains were found. Melissa Bartholomew, on July 10th, 2009, her cell phone travels from Midtown Manhattan also to Massapequa Park. The burner phone that contacted Melissa travels from Massapequa Park to Midtown Manhattan.
Cell phone data was a really big piece of evidence that the suspect likely lived in Massapequa Park and commuted to Midtown Manhattan.
Investigators had most everything they needed to name a suspect in this case back in 2011. But they didn't put it all together.
What we now know about the case is that you had just rampant corruption and ineptitude and infighting and dysfunction sort of plaguing the top ranks of the law enforcement in Suffolk County.
In late 2011, we find out there's going to be a major shakeup in the Suffolk County Police Department, and there will be a new chief of department, and his name is James Burke.
As it turns out, that was really bad news for the Long Island serial killer case. James Burke was appointed Chief of Department of the Suffolk County Police Department in 2012. That position of Chief of Department is typically reserved for career police officers who have been in a lot of different units within the police department and have these kind of powerful resumes. And that just wasn't James Burke.
There was no way this guy was qualified. He had a high school education, but you know, he could walk into a room and grab the room. He did have that. He had some sort of charisma like that.
Burke was a juvenile delinquent who somehow became a cop, and throughout his career as a cop was sort of chased by scandal.
We find out that over the years that he had relationships with sex workers. He actually partied with them in his police car, that his gun was not secured. A lot of things happened involving sex workers and James Burke.
You had a guy in charge of the department who patronized prostitutes. Now he's investigating the death of prostitutes. You almost can't make this up.
He had been ushered up the ranks of the police department partly through his relationship with Tom Spoda, the district attorney during the Gilgo Beach era. Spoda and Burke sort of had this symbiotic relationship. Burke had a really strong hand in getting Tom Spoda elected DA, and Tom Spoda, protected Burke. Burke is sort of this petty, vengeful figure. And once Burke is chief, he removes all of the top cops in various departments. And so that includes the chief of detectives who oversaw the Long Island serial killer case. And Burke also removes the top detectives from the investigation. What he said was that he wanted to get fresh eyes on the investigation. So essentially, the case was starting from scratch. Serial killer cases are typically aided by the federal authorities, but in this case, Burke and Spoda took steps to keep the federal government from gaining any access to the case. The FBI has this sort of vaunted unit, the Behavioral Analysis Unit, which does these profiles of serial killers, which are typically very helpful in honing in on a suspect. But Tom Spoda stops an FBI profiler from gaining access to evidence in the case. Spoda has defended it by saying, that he considered their work to be duplicative.
I think they just didn't want the feds involved. There are traditional rivalries between local law enforcement and federal agents, especially the FBI.
But the result is the Long Island serial killer case, it does not get the benefit of the sort of extensive toolkit that the FBI has in solving serial killer cases. Then in December 2012, this kind of random event occurs that would have seismic aftershocks. A low-level thief steals a duffel bag from the back of Burke's truck, and he starts going through it, and he finds sex toys and pornography in it. This was Burke's party bag. Burke assigns these top detectives to sort of crack this case, like this was some extremely serious crime. Ultimately, they do find the suspect. Burke shows up at the precinct where they're interrogating the suspect. He goes into the interrogation room, beat him pretty brutally. He's shackled to the ground, so he can't even lift his arms to protect his head as they're punching it, slapping it, choking him, threatening his mom, telling him that they're going to give him a hot shot, which is slang for a lethal heroin injection. And this all occurs in broad daylight in a crowded precinct. So there's lots of witnesses. Within a day or two, the FBI launches an investigation. When Burke learns that the feds are investigating, it sort of sets off major alarms in the highest ranks of Suffolk County Police Department and the DA's office. Burke, Tom Spoda, and other top officials are telling detectives to lie to FBI agents as to what actually happened. For the next several years, Burke is mired in this criminal cover-up, playing this cat and mouse game with the feds.
Jimmy Burke had his own life on the line, so it's safe to say the investigation into the Gilgo Beach murders during those years weren't a high priority for Chief Burke. Staying out of jail was a high priority for Chief Burke.
Years passed with so little information being released about the case that really it felt like to the authorities of Suffolk County, this was an afterthought.
Around the time this case kind of grinds to a halt, it's a good story, and the media picks it up. A book comes out called Lost Girls, which turns into a bestseller, and then it's made into a movie for Netflix. It centers around Shannan Gilbert and her mother's fight to find out what really happened to her daughter.
This is my daughter, Shannan Maria Gilbert. There's one here for every day that she's missing, and I'm going to continue posting these until you either find her or die of paper cuts.
How important was it for you to keep this story going?
Well, I have a big hope that the film will be well received and people after watching the end credits will become online sleuths or start talking, because there's been no closure for the families.
Then on A&E, you've got the killing season. And these amateurs who are basically going out there trying to solve the case themselves. And that really mirrors what's happening online.
Every lead we've uncovered only seems to take us further down the rabbit hole. Where should we go find him?
Same way he finds us, on Backpage.
It is a journey far darker than we could ever have imagined.
As it seems like the police aren't doing much to solve this case, that's when the public steps in to kind of fill this void. And you see them scouring the internet for clues, putting together theories that involve law enforcement. And it just makes you wonder, what effect does this have on the case when you've got all these armchair detectives working on the case day and night, and it doesn't feel like the police are doing as much?
From late 2012 through late 2015, the two top dogs in Suffolk County law enforcement, James Burke, who runs the police department, and the DA at the time, Tom Spoda, they keep pressure on the detectives who were at the beating to continue to lie under oath and to lie to FBI agents as to what actually happened, that Burke had beaten the suspect. For years, the police department and the DA's office is way too distracted with keeping Jimmy out of prison, and after that, keeping themselves out of prison, than they are with police work like the Long Island serial killer case.
Ultimately, a detective finds God, comes clean, and Burke gets arrested in December of 2015.
James Burke pleads guilty and is sentenced to 46 months in prison for assault and obstruction of justice. Tom Spoda is also indicted for helping Burke cover up the beating, and he's ultimately convicted at trial. But meanwhile, there's been essentially no progress in the Gilgo case, and it's all but dead.
In 2018, Geraldine Hart is sworn in as the new police commissioner.
Geraldine Hart, she wasn't part of the Old Boys Network. She also had worked for the FBI on Long Island. So I felt that Geraldine Hart would have a chance, through her connections to the FBI, to get this case back on track. And she did make some important announcements.
In a few minutes, I will release a photograph of a previously undisclosed piece of evidence found at one of the crime scenes. A black leather belt embossed with the letters HM or WH. We believe that the belt was handled by the suspect and did not belong to any of the victims.
3 of the Gilgo 4 victims were wrapped in camouflage burlap and bound with tape, with the exception of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. She was bound with 3 belts.
When these photos were released, the online chat rooms were eating it up and trying to sink their teeth into it as much as possible. A lot of people were looking for belt manufacturers that would have been back in Long Island at the time. Knowing that this was something that was personalized, maybe we could use this to help get an identity, especially with the initials.
In 2022, there's a new police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, who spent 30 years with the NYPD.
Suffolk County's new police commissioner officially sworn in today. Former NYPD Chief of Department Rodney Harrison making it official this morning.
I've known Rodney for a long time. He was the chief of detectives of New York City Police Department. You know, so he came to Suffolk with a renewed vigor.
You have Ray Tierney, a former federal prosecutor who is now the district attorney of Suffolk County, and both of them are committed to solving the Gilgo Beach case. So a task force is formed, and it includes the state police, the DA, the police department, and the FBI.
First step for this task force is going over existing evidence and existing witness reports and other documents in the case.
If you're investigating cold cases, I tell people you don't realize that the clue is already in the case file. And sometimes you need to bring in a fresh set of eyes.
One of the key pieces of evidence that cracked this case wide open had actually been there a dozen years before. There were some new interviews done of old witnesses. One of the people that was interviewed again was Amber Costello's roommate.
The roommate describes to police that the man who was in their home was very large, about 6'4", ogre-like, with bushy hair and wearing glasses.
One other thing that the roommate remembered: the man was driving a dark green vehicle that was a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, a very unique kind of vehicle. Investigators knew for at least a decade that there were two key areas they had to focus on where cell phone pings were detected, connected to burner phones and to victims' phones.
Midtown Manhattan, and a very specific part of Massapequa Park, Long Island, where they felt the killer most likely lives.
Investigators then search for owners of a Chevy Avalanche who also lives in Massapequa Park and commutes to Midtown Manhattan.
6 weeks after the task force was formed, investigators hone in on a suspect. His name, Rex Heuermann.
The police honed in on the man driving a dark green vehicle that was a first-generation Chevy Avalanche, and his name is Rex Heuermann.
This particular defendant also worked in the same area in Midtown Manhattan, which was the area of interest as per the phone analysis done by the FBI back in 2012.
After all these years, reporting on someone who's allegedly been evading authorities and evading us and evading the public, you want to know what made them tick. You want to know why.
In your office. Okay, great.
In 2022, he was interviewed by a real estate person that had some interest in the job that he did.
Can you smile?
That is. Rex Heuermann, I'm an architect, I'm an architectural consultant, I'm a troubleshooter, born and raised on Long Island.
Okay.
Been working in Manhattan since 1987. One of the things I learned from my father was furniture building.
Okay.
He was an aerospace engineer and built satellites and built furniture at home. And I still build it in the same exact workshop.
Rex Heuermann bought and lives in the house that he grew up in, Massapequa Park. That is where he spent his time with his wife and his children. Massapequa Park is a gorgeous neighborhood east of New York City with well-manicured lawns, beautiful homes. Everything looks perfectly normal.
A lot of the lawns nearby were very manicured, pretty houses surrounding his. His was considered sort of this ramshackle type house that you would not expect an architect to be living in.
He seemed to be very proud of the fact that his dad was an aerospace engineer, that his dad had taught him about woodworking, and they would do this kind of stuff together.
But then his father died when he was just 11 years old.
There were reports that he had been bullied in high school, probably because he was so big, and some people would call him names because of his size.
This is a guy who didn't have a lot of friends, a little awkward. We've heard this story before, right? Rex Heuermann went on to study architecture at the New York Institute of Technology on New York's Long Island.
Heuermann got his degree and became an assistant to an architect in Manhattan. And he quickly became known as a troubleshooter.
In New York, you've got all this red tape that you have to go through. Rex Heuermann was known in the community as somebody who knew these codes inside and out and could get around them quickly. The thing that's interesting about Rex Heuermann is that he is somebody that we weren't expecting, somebody that has a really good job, a good business. He has a family. In 1996, Rex Heuermann marries Asa Ellerup. The two had met at 7-Eleven on Long Island. She was an employee at 7-Eleven, and he used to go there, get his coffee, hang out, talk to her. They became friendly, and he was a frequent customer. Asa has a special needs son, and when they got married, Rex Heuermann actually raised him as his own, and they became a family. It's not just a gesture, it's a commitment. And that's really striking when you take a look at the compassion that must have been given in that relationship through these many years. And then you take that counterposition of the heinous acts that he is accused of committing, and it is just two completely separate people.
Part of his supposed MO is that he kills when his family is not around, whether they're on vacation or just away in general.
We all wear different roles, we all wear different hats. With Rex Heuermann, again, if he's guilty, and this is compartmentalization times a million, where not only am I thinking, okay, this is my life here, where I'm playing this role as father, husband, architect, and this is my role as a sexually motivated serial killer.
I was 25. I was an executive assistant at a small architecture firm. And part of this involved taking sets of drawings and paperwork back and forth to our expediter. And that was RH Consultants, which was Rex Heuermann's company. Rex was overly confident, even pompous. He really sold himself to people as the expert. He could get your plans in front of somebody because of his relationships, even when you were struggling. And in 2010, around the time I was ready to move on from my firm, he was looking to expand part of his business, and he needed some help. He said that he couldn't wait to see the look on my former boss's face when he found out I was working there. They had a somewhat antagonistic relationship with each other. That I knew, but I was not comfortable. It struck me as unprofessional. He thinks he's playing some kind of power game. And I was a sort of strange pawn in the middle of it. He also liked to say things for shock value. We knew he collected guns because he would go bear hunting. One time he said, "I hope you're not thinking about leaving. I'd have to shoot you." Something Rex would say, probably to get a rise out of you, you know. But it's a lot more serious when you consider that he may have actually been out hunting women at the time. And this is his mindset and his confidence level right around the time that he allegedly committed murder. He's not nervous, he's not looking over his shoulder. You know, he's walking around business as usual, playing stupid games. And that's really disturbing to me. It's like 2019, and I see Rex's former VP. She told me she had left the firm. Rex had just become more difficult over the years. So his former VP had started her own company.
When you have an employee who has decided, without his permission, to start her own firm, that would be, I think, just infuriating to him.
She told me one night she was there working late. It's early evening, you know, maybe 7 o'clock. The office was on the 2nd floor. She saw him downstairs, standing outside the office, like gazing up into the window. There wasn't really any good or comforting explanation for that. What was he doing there? They locked the doors because they didn't know what he was going to do. He wanted to let her know, I know what you're doing. I know where you are.
Did anybody look at him and go, this may be our serial killer right here? No. But there were certainly things about him that were off, that were scary or threatening, that things are not right with him.
When the task force formed in 2022, they zeroed in on Rex Heuermann as a suspect for the murders in Gilgo Beach.
He lived in Massapequa Park, and he commuted to Midtown Manhattan. He fit the physical description, and he drove a Chevy Avalanche. They then spent more than the next year plus cementing the case.
When Rex Heuermann became a suspect, all of his cell phone records were subpoenaed.
It turns out Rex Heuermann allegedly used multiple burner phones to contact victims, to contact sex workers. That's how he did his business.
Then police learned that burner phones that he had paid minutes for were in close proximity to his personal cell phone and to the victim's cell phones, either in Massapequa or in Midtown Manhattan where he worked. So then they had a connection.
They're pretty sure they have their man, but they need something that directly ties Rex to the victims. They need DNA.
When police were doing the investigation in 2011, there was a male hair that was found on the camouflage burlap on Megan Waterman.
With DNA evidence, especially with biological fluids, liquids, whatever it might be, blood, body, other body fluids, you have a chance of degrading it so much that you can't do anything with it. But things like hair follicles and all those other things, they kind of last forever.
So investigators really needed to find out if this hair was connected to him. In July of 2022, investigators set up outside of his home. Undercover detectives start going through his garbage. You know, they're looking for any kind of a bottle, anything that they can test to see if they can find his DNA. But nothing turns up. After 5 months of surveilling him, they decide they're going to focus on him at work and see what they can find. A surveillance team was set up outside of Rex Heuermann's office in Midtown Manhattan, and that is where they started to observe him.
What the task force decides to do is have undercover officers pose as sanitation persons, just hoping they'd find a way to get DNA from something that he used or something he threw away.
Watched him throw away a pizza box in a New York City trash bin.
The investigators immediately grabbed the pizza box. Inside the box, they found an uneaten pizza crust.
They take it out and they take a swab. and then they send it to the Suffolk County Crime Lab to test it for DNA. And it turns out the DNA that was found on the pizza crust matches the DNA from the root of the hair found on Megan Waterman.
That moment was kind of the final linchpin in the case. They knew that they had a case. They knew they could tie Rex Heuermann to the Gilgo Beach murders.
So they finally have the DNA evidence to make an arrest on Rex Heuermann. If this is their guy, they want to get him off the street before he may do any more harm.
And anytime you have somebody identified and that person's still at large, it's always a concern, because if you do it once, you could go out there and do it again.
But now they're in a really tough spot because they have to make sure they have a strong enough case so he can't get out. So they looked at what he was doing on the internet. Rex Heuermann's search history is beyond disturbing. Sadistic measures that involved children, that involved sex workers.
When we look at crime scene behaviors and we see the wrapping and maybe ligatures that we find, this is consistent with somebody who would be looking at violent pornography, at domination and control, and deviant pornography.
They also found searches that were looking up the very investigation into what turned out to be him as the main suspect. He really seemed to want to know where investigators were at. His searches include very specific words. A list of each and every victim that was a part of the Gilgo Four.
Rex Heuermann had searched for information about the Gilgo Beach murders more than 200 times.
The thing that sort of jumps out at you was he was also searching for the victims' family members, their sisters, and in one instance, their child. So that was concerning.
I mean, it's just mind-blowing. This idea that oftentimes offenders are online with you. You can be rubbing shoulders with someone in a community who could actually be the killer.
Once they had this evidence gathered, they made their move.
It was a Thursday night. Unbeknownst to any reporter in town, a team of police officers walked up behind Rex Heuermann as he left his office in Midtown Manhattan. They surrounded him. And they quietly told him, "You're under arrest." And he didn't resist. He seemed a little surprised, but he didn't resist.
Major developments in a decades-old serial killer case. There has been an arrest of a suspect linked to the Gilgo Beach murders from Long Island, New York. Police have not released the identity of the person they have in custody. We do know that he's in his 50s or 60s.
It felt like the world stopped. Anybody who's been following this case stopped what they were doing. What do you mean there's been an arrest? Who could it be? What's the name? How old is this person? Where does this person live? All these questions are flooding your mind. And it turns out this architect, Rex Heuermann, he is in custody, arrested for 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims. Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, and Amber Costello.
Rex, did you do it?
We got a glimpse of him on the news. You just thought, wow, there's the suspect. That's who they've been looking for. The very fact that nobody knew that investigators were zeroing in on Rex Heuermann is really, truly remarkable, considering all this investigation has been through over the many years.
The internet essentially goes insane. And a big part of that is because there was no information for so long. I mean, it was something that was unfathomable for so many people.
I just thought it was a joke. I thought it was like some kind of meme or something. I don't even know, like for a second. It's just like, you absolutely cannot see that that is a real thing in front of you because it's so shocking.
When the arrest was announced and I saw Rex Heuermann, I just sort of noticed the deadness in his eyes. He didn't seem that bothered. I noticed he didn't say anything. I was there when the indictment was unsealed and it was packed. There were a number of victims' family members there. Megan Waterman's daughter was there. Melissa Barthelomy's sister that got the alleged taunting calls was there. It was very electric. It was moving.
I would first and foremost like to offer my deepest condolences to the family members.
Just going back to the very beginning of when these women went missing and the very idea that maybe nobody would miss them. We've learned through the years and through the interviews that the victims' families have given is that they were very much loved. They were very much missed. And these families, they were desperate to find answers.
I can only imagine what you had to endure over the last decade.
So after all these years of searching, it's very possible there's finally an answer for these victims' family members. Perhaps we finally can put a name and a face to the monster that we have been thinking about for all these years.
When I first heard the case against him, this high-tech, very careful, lengthy investigation that involved DNA and surveillance and cell phone data, I was sort of struck by, there it is, right? There's police work. And that's sort of what was missing from so many years of this case, was just police doing their jobs.
The state police and the Suffolk County Police descended on Rex Heuermann's house the morning after he was arrested. They were looking for evidence of more victims, evidence of trophies of the victims we knew about.
This is a search that lasted 12 days. Hundreds of search warrants were issued for this home. And we saw, the cameras were outside down the block watching investigators go in and out. There was a command post set up outside of their home.
I was told early on by law enforcement that Rex Heuermann was something of a hoarder. There was a lot of clutter in the house. There was a lot to go through. Inside the house was this concrete-lined steel vault that was in the basement, where he kept more than 280 guns. The investigators not only went to his house, there were at least 2 storage units that they searched. We were told by the police commissioner that the search was very fruitful, but the authorities did not want to get specific.
This comes as the investigation into the accused killer grows even wider across the country. Police in Atlantic City are now taking a new look at the cold case files of 4 sex workers killed in 2006.
Almost as soon as Rex Heuermann was arrested, law enforcement started looking at properties that he was connected to. Rex Heuermann had property in South Carolina, and that's where law enforcement found a green Chevy Avalanche, and that was seized by the New York State Police. Law enforcement started looking at missing people or murders that he could be attached to.
A woman in South Carolina says a friend of hers who went missing 6 years ago was last seen with a man who fits the description of Rex Heuermann.
There is still a slim chance that she could be alive.
And there are other investigations going on in places like Las Vegas, where he has property.
The cold case investigators there said they were checking to see if there were any victims whose circumstances were similar to the Gilgo Beach victims.
So far, law enforcement in all these jurisdictions haven't announced any connections between Rex Heuermann and their cases. But when you put it all together, where is that going to lead this investigation? Rex Heuermann's family maintains that they had no idea what was going on. And a lot of people say that's hard to believe, but it's actually a story that we've heard before.
Heuermann's wife was extremely upset. Once the investigators had finished their 12 days of searching, she told her lawyers that the house had virtually been destroyed. And they released photos of the house.
And his wife, Asa Ellerup, files for divorce. There have been reports that she has been suffering through breast cancer. I mean, talk about having the literal rug ripped out from underneath you. So you've got that happening at your house. You've got the man who is providing the financial stability in your house and the insurance. Everything you know is now over.
Asa Ellerup, she's been struggling financially, and things have been rough for her and her 2 adult kids. But tonight we can report exclusively that Ellerup and the couple's 2 children signed a production deal for a documentary about their ordeal. They're being paid at least $1 million for this. Their lawyers are getting about $600,000.
A lot of people were taken aback because you don't really hear about a deal like this all that often. And it's kind of been this thorny issue for many people because the victims' families are struggling. But the attorney for Rex Heuermann's family says they're struggling too.
Speaking of my clients and my clients only, their existence now is as bleak and as hardscrabble as you can imagine. In fact, one of the things that they're trying to get back, and they filed their notice of claim, are vintage jackets and clothes that they need for the winter. This is no joke. Their road ahead is arduous, it is long, and no matter what happens with this case, no matter if he's acquitted, convicted on all counts, or something in between, their lives will never be the same.
Beyond Rex's family, many people, and rightly so, believe that the focus should be on the victims and their families.
I really had no picture in my mind of what the Long Island serial killer would look like. And when I saw Rex Heuermann, if he indeed is the killer, he was so big compared to them. A lot of the victims were so petite. As Amber Costello's aunt said, these girls never had a chance.
I've cried because, you know, I've been thinking about, I think about her all the time. And for, you know, the other family members and these girls being sex workers, they're all way more than that.
If these women were college students or nurses or police officers or teachers, this may have had a different outcome in the way it was covered and the type of attention it may have had. And in many cases, these women were just trying to make a better life for their own families. And that is one of the real tragedies, because had these cases been front and center, like we've seen with other missing person cases, who knows where we would be today. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty and maintains his innocence. But it looks like we're just at the beginning of finding out what he was up to all those years.
And nobody knows exactly what's going to happen at the trial. Will he cop a plea? Will he go through the limelight of an actual jury? And if he is guilty, then the danger of Rex Heuermann, like almost every serial killer, is that they hide in plain sight. We never suspect them because of how normal they look, how normal they behave. They always have a double life. I mean, by definition, serial killers are successful because nobody suspects them.